Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Maeve Bulger. I work with Friends of the Earth Europe. We're also a member of the Rethink Plastic Alliance, who are hosting the talk show this evening along with our co-host Plastics Recyclers Europe. So Rethink Plastic Alliance are made up of 7 large European NGOs. I'll just talk a little bit through why we're organising this event and then go through the plan for the evening. So most of you know in this room that the Chinese government recently this year banned imports of plastic waste. Many of you also know that the EU exports 40% of the plastics we collect for recycling, and most of this goes to China. We also know that the traceability of where this exported waste is exported from and finally ends up and how it's managed is extremely unclear. The conditions at the final how it's managed are often unknown. The tracking is a bit murky. So we also know that the EU are publishing their strategy on plastics before the end of the year. So we see these two ongoing realities and discussions as a much needed debate and an opportunity really to rethink how we produce, consume and dispose of plastics in Europe and how we can take responsibility for that and manage the waste better ourselves within Europe and reduce the amount of waste that we produce in the first place. So we'll have stakeholders debating these topics from NGOs in China and Europe, European waste management industry, recycling industry, recyclers in Europe and the US, European Commission. So there's going to be 2 sessions. The first is on the realities that we need to integrate into the strategy on plastics, so looking at the global market outlook for plastics. The second session will be on more about working upstream, so what are realistic measures we can take for plastics reduction and better recycling capabilities within Europe. We also have some international colleagues in the audience from Malaysia, India, China, Indonesia, the US and Colombia who are working on these issues at a grassroots level. So we might get to hear some of their input throughout the night as well. And afterwards there'll be drinks and soup outside. So I'll hand it over to our moderator, Camille. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. So that was a very comprehensive introduction. I think we're just going to jump in. I'll just give a few practical details. We've made a small projection on the floor as well from over there, just so we can have the world map at all times in front of us, because we're talking about a global reality here. And you have a funny little game. If you just push against the platform over there, it's going to move everything. Just a bit of entertainment. But yeah, thanks for putting this together. My name is Camille Duran. I'm a journalist and a podcaster. I'm currently running a 15-episode podcast series on ocean plastic. So we're very deep in those issues. And at this very moment, we're working on the topic of China. So it was perfect timing to jump in. And I would say that we have a format here that really allows for interaction and audience questions. I think you should really feel free to jump in, and we're going to try to manage the time accordingly. So every time for each panel, I have, we have a couple of interludes and things that are more like short discussion, but for the panels, I'll just get the discussion going, and then we'll try to leave enough room for questions. So there will be no slides. It's pure, casual discussion on those issues. And so I invite you to jump in. And first, we're going to talk about the impact of EU policy on Asian waste management. And to do so, I have with me Froman Great, who is flying from the Philippines, and Dharmesh Shah, that I'm inviting to come on stage here. And I'm going to give you a microphone, and we're just going to get started. Please welcome them with a round of applause. All right. flying a long way. What are you up to in Brussels? Like, what brings you here for Len?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for having us here. We're here for a few meetings. This morning we met with the European Commission, and yesterday we had a plastics recycling workshop, and a few other meetings.
So, what is the mission of you coming to Europe, and what are some of the key messages around, the impact of EU policy on Asian waste management? And I invite you, Dharmesh, to jump in first, maybe.
One of the main concerns is, of course, EU is a very powerful kind of power in global power, and especially when you look at Asian countries, they really look up to countries in the EU for solutions. And more often than not, I think what we see is a lot of problematic solutions are sold to governments in these countries, and these often undermine a lot of the work that's happening in the country, especially with recycling. A lot of these countries have a huge informal sector that does a lot of recycling. Technologies that are usually transferred from from European nations are quite problematic, and something that we raised also with the meeting today morning with the European Commission is that that's something that we need to really kind of rethink. The EU needs to rethink its approach with regards to what it proposes as solutions in Asian countries.
Can you give an example of a solution that is inappropriate?
So incineration, for instance, EU has a lot of European countries like Denmark, Sweden, Germany have a huge industry on incineration, and often these companies lobby with their governments, and through bilateral trade agreements or through bilateral negotiations, they try to enter the Asian markets, and where they set up these big incinerators to burn all the waste that is otherwise recycled. So that's where our main concern lies.
And what are maybe solutions that you're putting forward? Like, what would you like things to look like clearly when it comes to waste management solutions in Asia that can also address like a large scale of material? We're talking about huge amounts, which is why those solutions like incinerations are attractive in the first place, because they can deal with large amounts of materials. What do you answer to that?
So, as Dharmesh just mentioned, one of our fears is that wrong solutions are being exported, aside from waste, to Asia. And our fear is that these would undermine existing successes and models that we have in Asia. For example, in the Philippines, we have cities that have achieved 7 to 8% waste diversion through segregation, composting, and recycling. And when you introduce these technologies like waste to energy and incineration, these would undermine existing work that's happening there right now.
Okay. And the scalability of this existing work, I mean, you're managing to demonstrate that this can really address the problem, because there is the waste coming from the Western world, but there's also the waste from the region in very large amounts. So you're actually trying to scale the models that are working. Can you give an example, for instance, of something that is scalable?
Well, yes and no. Yes, that it's in some level, communities and cities in the Philippines and in Asia are able to address the problem, and these can be replicated. In fact, that's currently being done across different countries, like in Indonesia, in India, and the Philippines, and Malaysia. The problem is that, going back to the city that I cited a while ago, after you do composting, after you do recycling, you are still left with products that are way beyond the capacity of the cities and the communities to manage. And these, when we do our brand and waste audits in these beach cleanup or in the cities that we work with, we identify these really problematic products, and a lot of these products are manufactured by European or American companies.
Okay, so there's also a debate to be had at the design stage, which is something we're going to talk about. I'd like to talk 1 minute about the evolution of the problem, because we know the problem is there. But can you speak to what has happened over the last maybe 3 to 5 years, or what are the trends that you observe? Maybe you, Dharmesh.
Well, one of the obvious things is, of course, the disposal culture, that was imported from the West. and a lot of the Asian countries have adopted that, and disposability is a good thing, you know, so more consumption, more wasting, and somehow even now, like, you know, the way India perceives its growth is based on consumption. So certainly, and plastics are not seen as a problem, but they're mostly seen as a waste management problem. So it's like if you manage it well, plastics are not a problem. Is how it's perceived. But that's not the fact. You know, at some point we'll have to look at reducing our consumption of plastics and unsustainable materials that are not recyclable. The problem, I think, and is of course linked to the whole hydrocarbon extraction industry, which is also booming in a lot of these countries. So as we see the automobiles moving towards more, you know, renewable sources, oil is finding new avenues. So
Right.
plastics is of course the next logical thing. So plastic manufacturers like Dow and DuPont are looking at this as a, you know, a lifeline sort of thing, you know.
Right.
So that certainly is evolving, and we don't know. I mean, consumption in India is still very low. It's only 8 kgs per person, and half of that is packaging waste. But if you look at the US, which is 100 kgs per person per year,
Right.
which is way high, right? So these countries have a lot more to address in that sense, yeah, certainly.
Okay, so plastic is kind of the new business for the oil industry, and so the trend is, you know, responding to that. I want to talk 1 minute about China, and which is one of the main topics we want to address today, and the ban that was announced on 24 categories of waste that would be banned to import in China as of January 1st, coming very, very quickly. This was announced in June or July, I believe. So you're from India, you're from Philippines, from the Asian perspective in general, how do you react to this, and what is your analysis, and what do you anticipate for the couple of years to come?
Well, one, on the Chinese side, we appreciate that, you know, things are moving in the direction. But for Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, we're worried that if it's status quo for first world countries, for European countries, for example, where you export 40% of your waste, and China, who used to receive most of this waste, refused to accept that, where would it go now? Would it be dumped to these countries in Southeast Asia? So that is a clear worry for a lot of the groups working on this issue.
Right.
For India, I think, so we have similar laws in India as well. So we're not allowed to import post-consumer rejects, which is like used plastics. The Indian government prohibits import of plastics. But we do get a lot of post-production rejects, which is after factories have, you know, a lot of factories have waste plastics that are good quality, not used. So that is then sent in huge quantities to India. But there's some discussion about phasing that out as well. So I think India is kind of already conscious about the fact that it does not want to receive a lot of this waste.
So it may start a trend in Asia, other countries jumping in on this kind of ban as well.
Yes, yes. So I think India had this law much before as well.
Okay.
But it didn't really now because China's law has come into, you know, has been announced. India does become the next logical place to send all this stuff. But India also has strict laws, so I think that's where, you know, the concern that Troy just mentioned is it's kind of, you know, it elevates a little more, because a lot of Southeast Asian countries, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, they all receive a lot of these rejects.
One last question. If you can try to be very specific, you coming to Europe right now to discuss policy and changes to the system and to what's going on with that plastic being exported from Europe specifically to Asia. What are specific action points in the short term that you would really like to see addressed here in Brussels?
I think one would be for Europe to provide the leadership, one of which is to advance the narrative on the right solutions. You have great policies here on EPR, on deposit systems, on zero waste cities in Italy, for example. These are the stories that we want to be elevated, and we want cities in Asia to follow, and not the promotion of the wrong solutions.
The other thing could be, I mean, of course, a lot of the Asian countries have a lot of recycling capacity. Certainly, something that needs to be promoted but a lot of the recycling happens in extremely hazardous conditions, a lot of labor issues. So technology transfer, certainly, you know, if there is good practices that and good technology that can be exported to these countries rather than just talking about incineration as a technology transfer.
Right.
So certainly that is something that EU can take some kind of a lead on, in addition to what Troy just said.
Thank you for passing by. We're going to talk more about all this, and please feel free to ask your questions after at the mingle to Froilan and Dharmesh. There's a lot to be discussed, but let's close with a round of applause. And thank you. So that's a good start. I think now it's time for a bit of storytelling. I would like to call Martin Borky to the panel. And he's a recycler flying in from Berkeley, California, and we talked on the phone already last month about one little experiment that you have made, and I titled this section "A Recycler Turned Spy." Is that a good way to?
Well, what we've been doing is
You got it on. Let's say.
check.
Yeah. Great.
What we've been doing is a little under the radar, and I think it does require a little bit of garbage espionage to find out where our materials are actually going.
Right. So I'm going to guide the discussion with short questions. We're going to do this discussion in 3 parts. So of course, at the end of this part, there's going to be a cliffhanger, and you will be like, "Oh, what's going to happen?" But then Martin will come back to tell us the rest of the story. But in one sentence, can you tell me what does your experiment consist of, and why have you decided to go that way?
So we're a curbside recycler in Berkeley, California, and the bales that you saw in the previous slide look exactly like the ones in our recycling yard. And for many years, we didn't collect non-bottle plastics because we were unsure where the materials were going, and they didn't have good markets, and it's very costly to collect and process them. But our city asked us to do that, and after many years of negotiation with our city council, we did collect those materials. And for some time, we knew exactly where they were going, to a facility in China that we felt had good environmental and labor standards. But after the green fence and new regulations came into place in China, that relationship broke down, and we no longer knew where our materials were going. And so we felt we needed to, in order to tell our customers, the residents of Berkeley, who are very interested in recycling and want to know where their materials go, you know, we felt we needed to do more research to find out where the materials were actually going.
So you gave a call to the custom or to your broker, and you said, "Where are you sending it to?" And he gave you the answer, no?
Yeah, so our broker buys from recyclers throughout the West Coast, and then they sell to a broker in Asia, or one of many brokers in Asia, and then after that, we just can't see where it goes.
So you wouldn't be able to tell you this is going there?
No, they give us a lot of fluffy answers about how well it's being recycled, and you know, try to build our confidence, but then we see images from Asia of things being burned or dumped in waterways, or recycled in backyards in very unhygienic situations, or exploitative environments. So
yeah,
we want to know for sure.
So what did you do?
So we looked around at existing off-the-shelf GPS technology. We found a company called Tracking the World that makes a small GPS tracker. For those of you old enough to remember pagers, it's about the size of a pager or a small cell phone, and it has a SIM card that goes inside it and a cell package, a data package that comes with it for 3 months. And once a day it will send out a message. If it can see a satellite up in the sky, it will get a very accurate GPS reading, just like your smartphone, of its location down to, you know, several meters. If it can't see the sky, it sends out a cell ping and looks for cellular towers, and then it can get, you know, triangulating off the cell towers a location within maybe a quarter mile. And so we wedged one of these into one of those bales that you saw previously, and waited for it to ship out.
So you failed a few of them first.
Yeah, we tried getting them through all our recycling equipment and getting it into the baler, and they got crushed, and some of them didn't work. We tried 4 or 5, and finally one of them managed to get into a bale, and I could see it there pinging in our recycling yard. And
So wait.
there it is, right by my office.
You wake up in the morning. You have your cup of coffee. First thing you do, for sure, you open the computer. You look where it is, right?
Yeah, and it's gone. And I'm like,
Oh, so
so is it broken? Did it just stop pinging? It's no longer in our yard.
So we'll find out in next part
Yes.
where it landed. Right? Thank you, Martin. Let's give it a round of applause. So now I'm going to call our next panels. I'm just going to grab the microphone here. So I'll call you back because we're going to be actually 5 here right now. I'm going to call. So let me get my notes so I get the spelling right. Yes. So first, Li Wenchen, who is visiting us from China, and let's give her a round of applause as well as the comment. Nadine Lebret from FEAD, representing the waste management industry in Europe. Welcome. Anna Abrazevica, if you want to sit on the other side over there, you're coming from DG Grow here in Brussels. Thank you. Your policy officer. And Dr. Kostas Velis, who is coming from University of Leeds, flying in for the talk show. Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring a microphone to you here. So, this one is for you actually, sorry. So, first I'd like to go through a round of thoughts. Very in short, what was your reaction when you heard about the Chinese ban? And did you see it coming? Did you realize directly what it would imply, and what is going on right now within your organization to face this new reality, or how do you approach this? Maybe starting over there with you, Anna.
My reaction. Is it working? Yeah. So I was on holidays by that time, in the middle of nowhere in Spain. So my reaction was I didn't know about it. So when I came back to the office, I saw a lot of emails, and then I learned about it. And well, from DG Growth perspective, the reaction was that we were surprised about the short notice that was left to
Right.
everyone to understand what it is about and how we will deal with our waste in the future. So it was at the beginning, I think it was a bit of misunderstanding and some misgivings about the impact, what it will have, and then we just started to discuss things with our colleagues in different DGs, in DG Trade, and also our colleagues abroad in China, and discussions are ongoing on this.
Right, and we're going to talk more about this, of course. Kostas, if you may share your thoughts on this, and maybe you can say, where were you when you heard about it?
Well, I'm not sure, possibly somewhere in a conference, but like here today. So did I see it coming? No. Was I surprised? No, not at all, because 3 years ago we published a report as part of the Globalization and Waste Management Task Force of the International Solid Waste Association, talking exactly about this topic. And we sort of warned the world about it, and sometimes it takes a crisis really to pay attention to something. So it would happen one day. It's really, it would happen. Now, what's my first reaction to that? I tried to find out how serious I think are. Things seem to be a bit more serious than the previous Green France operation incident, because
Right.
I felt the whole thing. And
Okay.
yeah, it's interesting times.
Yes, I think everyone would agree with that. Nadine, maybe crossing with another question, looking at the challenges that the waste management industry in Europe is facing, the plans for infrastructure development, and how this news is sort of coming into that discussion. What is the reaction right now?
Yes, I think it did not come as a surprise as such. Maybe the way it was notified and the reaction time, as I heard, was not exactly respected. Today there is still a lot of unclarity because the waste streams that are banned or are supposed to be banned soon, there have been a shortcut in licenses for imports, but we don't know exactly which grades are banned, to what extension, for how long. So there are still a lot of unclarities. Is it a temporary measure? Will it be a long-term measure? But this being said, I think in the European Union we should not be surprised. I mean, if you look at the population of China, if you see the middle class, raising, becoming wealthier, they need to think of sustainable solutions. And I think for us, as European Union, we should deal with it, not only by looking at it in a surprising effect, but taking it as an opportunity and as a challenge, as a wake-up call, actually. And the main message that we would have as waste management industry, private waste management industry, is that there needs to be, in this plastic strategy and in hopefully upcoming legislation, a clear demand call, because we all talk about better sorting, better collection, better recycling, but we need to make sure where will these quality recyclates go, where will be the demand. Right. So if there is a demand locally, and I mean locally at European level, there would be no necessarily need to export.
Yes.
So
that's we're going to get back to this. I'm sure there are some questions around that in the room as well. To your right is Li Wenchen. Should I call you Li Wen? Yeah. Yes. Who is visiting us from China? So you probably have a different reading, or maybe not so different. I don't know on the situation. But you work with the Chinese Zero Waste Alliance, so on the NGO front, and you've been very close to those issues, of course, geographically as well. How do you see this, and what is the mood right now in China on plastic recycling?
Actually, when I first, like you said, when Greenfence started in 2013, we didn't know what really happened on the ground, because since 2009 I once visited several plastic recycling centers in northern China, but when in 2011 it's already shut down. But we heard lots of stories about how the companies are reacted to our Greenfence policy. But Greenfence ended very soon. But this year, and when the new policy for banning the import of plastic and also other solid waste, we could see very strongly from the industries for plastic recycling. They're talking how to move their business out of China, because that means they could not do that in China now.
Right.
So, yeah.
And is the standard, does the standard tend to be lower in other countries than China when it comes to this recycling that is not really controlled or you see what I mean?
Yeah. I should say that since over the past years, particularly when China's air pollution attracted the whole world to look at, and then the government started several new policies to try to make the air pollution control and other pollutions improvement. So I don't know the environment policies in maybe other countries in our neighbors, but I could see the rising control for pollution in China.
Right.
So I think one thing I'm not ever very sure is that when China's in late 1990s became the center of the manufacturing for the whole world, the demand for secondary materials include like plastic increased so much over the past 20 years. But when China's economy started slowing down, and that means a lot. I mean, maybe one thing is the air pollution control, but others means like the demand for good environment, and also for like the materials. And then doesn't only like mean environment, but also like very comprehensive and complex society changes, particularly in 2013 when the new President Xi Jinping came to his office. We could strongly feel that policies in environment, pollution control, and other aspects has changed a lot.
Okay, so this is serious. Who likes to speculate in the room? I do. A little bit. I'm the only one. I said it's going to be a challenge for everyone, because I wanted to speculate a little bit on what is going to happen, or at least discuss what are the ways forward, because we're talking about millions of tons of plastic scraps or from those waste categories. So it's not just a little bit. There's the long-term analysis of, okay, what does it say? It's an opportunity for us to step up our game and so on. But in the short term, January 1st, what happens to all those tons? Are they going to stay at the border? Are they going to stay in Europe? Anna, do you have any insight on this? No? Okay.
No information for the deadline, actually. For now, it stands for January 2018, and I think it's going to stay like this, but yeah.
Okay.
Nothing more.
Difficult to say. Kostas, what is your how do you see this with your expert eye?
Well, yes, you can't predict the future. If you were all millionaires or billionaires, if you could predict the future. So new outlets are actively sought already. So it's not that the ban is going to hit on the 1st of January and we'll see a crisis. Right? So the crisis is already here. Whether these new markets will be able to absorb, I don't know, but definitely Southeast Asia is the key area targeted, and we haven't seen much processing in Africa. To me, the big question is that all the pollution, all the low-cost activities are going to be sifted as Asia is becoming more aware of these issues, is going to be sifted to Africa.
Okay.
So I don't know about the 1st of
January,
but definitely mid-term, I see Africa as being targeted as the next outlet.
Okay, so you see new markets. Nadine, in Europe, are we looking at more incineration in the short term? And should we worry about that?
Well, there is a risk because there is an urgent need to set up the appropriate waste management infrastructure. We know that for years. The problem is, if you invest as a private company in setting up this waste management infrastructure, you also need to have legal certainty. You need to have a clear regulatory framework. You need to know that if you do the effort, that you do the investment, that there is a pool, that there is an uptake of your recycled material.
Right.
So, and for plastics, this is somehow not yet sufficiently the case.
Yeah.
So, so yes, there is a risk of further export. I think it's not per se, if this material is needed, it can be exported.
Right.
What you need is a resilient market, is to be able to have a constant supply as manufacturer. And so if there is a plastic strategy that is coming up, it will be not sufficient in our view to yeah, to talk about sharing best practices, voluntary commitments. They are welcome, of course, but you need clear rules and clear pull measures to make it happen.
So I'm going to shuffle the cards a little bit because we're getting into infrastructure and incentives for recyclers in Europe. How about like just going even more upstream at looking at good design and what gets put in the market in the first place by brands? This has tremendous potential. I mean, we know that for a number of products we can just address large amounts of low-grade plastic that we just get out of the way just looking at design stage and producer's responsibility. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think first steps are being made. Eco-design is the key. So if the circular economy package was withdrawn in the first place, it was to close the circle. So this very first stage is the most important step, if you ask me, in the entire chain.
So in the plastic strategy, just to be the most important
absolutely.
Focus, single-use plastic.
You need to design a product so as to enable it to be reused, recycled at the end of its life.
Okay.
It's not that we cannot recycle certain plastics, but the more complex it gets, the more costly it gets.
Right.
And you will continue to have to compete with plastics from virgin raw material.
Right.
And that is a key issue because, you know, the oil price dropped
Yeah.
tremendously. So who will want to do the job, basically, in a cost-efficient way?
Yep. I'm just going to jump over to Anna. Anna, I know you cannot talk. You cannot talk about the content of the plastic strategy, even if I want to ask you about it, of course. But what can you say when it comes to the vision for Europe from the Commission's perspective when it comes to jobs, infrastructure? Where are we looking at a local service economy with short supply chains and short circles, or are we looking at this large infrastructure vision where the jobs are you know, following a different topology and more international, and where there's still a lot of trade of materials? Like, can you speak a little bit to this, to the different options at the vision level?
Well, of course, well, I can't say what will happen on 1st January with this Chinese ban, but the Commission is currently working on providing long-term solutions, not just a quick fix for this, like just Chinese ban or ban from India or other Asian countries that might decide to ban one day. And what we don't want to is, yes, we have a quick fix solution and then be in the same situation in 5 years and have to restart all the reflection and all the process in finding the way out of the current system where, well, models are too linear and we don't have this circularity and we don't work towards more circular plastics. And regarding jobs and growth, we know that circular economy is actually an opportunity to provide also skilled jobs. It's not only about small jobs. It's nothing wrong with those jobs, but it's also to go actually to think about only the quantity, how many jobs we'll create, but what will be the positive impact on economy, on innovation, on technological solutions, and how also not only, well, we don't want to export our waste, we want to export our knowledge, our savoir-faire, what we can do as a European, globally, what we can provide also and bring to the world. So, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open for questions in 1 minute, so get ready because it's first. Can I ask maybe Delphine or Maeve to spot, because I don't see very well. But first I want to ask, while you get ready, I want to ask Kostas for his top 3. Like, not looking only at recyclability and global markets, but from the perspective of the EU plastic strategy, what are the top 3 things you would like to see into it, looking also at reduction and design and so on?
Oh my God, you asked me to prioritize, that's not good. Top 3. First, reality. Set reasonably ambitious targets for what can be recycled. Because I think the current ones are not reasonable in any way, and that's one reason why you're here. Number two, I would agree with what has been said before. Look at pull markets, look at demand. Try to see where you can create demand, not just pushing the material, forcing the collection, because this is what we've been doing for 40 years now, and this has led us here. And number three, look at technological innovation, combined both on the materials, but also on the reprocessing, on the sorting and reprocessing. So we need all these three elements to work if we are to see mid-term changes. Any substantial changes will be mid-term.
I'm sure there are other ideas in the room additional to this. Let's open to question. I want to leave some room. Let's take a good 5 minutes for exchange here. Who wants to jump in? Over here. If you can give your name and the organization you represent, please.
Thank you. My name is Valérie Pelmaison. I represent FNAP, the French Association for Waste Management Companies, private companies. We're a member of it.
Okay.
Very simple question. Nadine addressed the issue, and Kostas also, on how to make a shock on demand, how to raise the demand, because the market is full of material based on crude oil or based on recyclates. Recyclates quality may be improved, but the investments will not happen for improvement of the quality if we are not convinced that someone will buy that. And the reason why, one of the reasons why it is not bought enough, is that it's a bit more expensive to use recyclates than to use crude oil-based plastics.
Right.
So just think about the renewable energy legislation. It's better to use renewable energy for the reasons everyone knows, but it's more expensive than conventional ones. So the European legislation has tried since years to put more than incentives, but to oblige for renewable content of the energy production and consumption. Right. So what would be the reaction to the Commission towards such a reflection? We don't have the levels of recycled content, or it's very complex, but right. Without such a pool, the situation will remain nearly the same, whatever the quality.
So shifting the balance, or obliging, mandating recycled contents within to not face cheaper virgin materials always taking over. Over here first, and then we'll take it.
Well, I think part of the answer was in the question already. The problem actually is the price of recyclates and of the process of recycling. So if you can balance the price, at least make it equal, virgin materials and recyclates, then maybe because it also looks good for brands to use recycled content in their products, they can always market it and use it for advertising and for the consumers, and maybe just find a mechanism to compensate. Maybe that's a solution. Not telling that this is what is in the plastic strategy, but one of the things that we can think about.
Well, I hear you coming, so I would want to react to this. Indeed, I think that a strategy on plastics needs to foresee those mechanisms, because the recycling industry is not getting the benefit for the externalities that it's avoiding: CO2 emission reduction, energy savings. The primary raw materials sector, the externalities that they cause are not factored in necessarily in the price of a plastics product. So you need to find a balance there which will help at least to close this cost gap. And it is key, because unless we find ways around this, it can be a carbon tax, it can be, any mechanism that can monetize somehow the benefits that recycling creates, and penalizes let's say, products that cause a lot of external cost, but which are not necessarily factored in their price. So unless that balance is better struck, it will be very difficult to be competitive.
Okay.
Just if I can add one
Sure,
more
please.
thing, I don't think there's only one measure that should be taken, and then everything is solved. Even if we find this mechanism to compensate the prices, we must ensure that recycled are of quality. For quality recycled materials, we need quality of input for recycling. We need volumes. We need good collection schemes. We need separate collection schemes. It's the whole system that must work properly to get there. So it's not only about price. It's not only about quality. It's everything all together.
Of course not.
If I may just add, if we have the time, I would tend
Very
to think,
quickly, please, yes.
if I tend to think that this is not just a European Union topic, because whoever puts taxes, this is what you're talking about, and I agree, you should really incorporate through taxes or subsidies the externalities, should disadvantage itself. So it's a matter to be resolved on OECD level, it's not just EU level. And then, what you said is absolutely spot on. Even if we collect all this material, do we have really the quality in this material and the quantity to substitute virgin materials within Europe, 20% of the global plastics production? Can we do it? To which degree? So we should talk numbers and facts, not just aspirations, and this should be our starting point. Currently, we don't, is my opinion.
Okay. Thank you. A lot of great questions to follow up on at the mingle. We're going to give a big round of applause to our panel. And we should see this as appetizer because, of course, there's so much to discuss. It's very hard to keep everything within 90 minutes. We're going to look right now. We're going to watch a quick interlude to take the time to reflect on all this, and we're going to take a trip from Hamburg to Asia on a container ship. This is called A Race to the Bottom, and it was prepared by Javier, sitting behind me, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. So of course the trip takes a bit more than 5 minutes in reality. But Martin, that could have been one of your containers if you want to join me for the part 2 of your story. And maybe we give a round of applause to Javier. Yeah, so where were we? So you wake up, you open, like you make a cup of coffee, you run to the computer. You lost, like how long it's been since you've lost the signal now?
So it disappeared for about 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
And
you're worried.
I was worried. I didn't know if it was just going to disappear like other ones in the past, but I got up another morning and made my cup of coffee and opened and clicked on my tracker button, and there's a little blip going in Hong Kong.
Woo! Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Okay.
So it took roughly from our office to the Port of Oakland and then across the Pacific, maybe 20 days.
Okay. And Hong Kong was kind of expected, no? Or
yeah, if I had to guess, that would be first option. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what happens next? Like here, it's in the port. How do you? So can you visualize from the satellite imagery what it looks like, or what's going on?
I just get a dot on the screen that gives me, an approximate location. I'm assuming it's still in the container, in the shipping container.
Okay.
So it's getting, within a quarter mile. So I'm getting little blips around the port. Pretty quickly, within a couple days, it went to the mainland of China, up South China Sea to another port.
Okay.
And then it went to a few hundred miles to another location. And this area, you could zoom in a certain amount. Google Earth doesn't give you a great detail in China, so you could kind of see structures, and it was a rural area, but with sort of an industrial feel to it, and some big water ponds, and and was there for a couple weeks, and then it moved again to another location. And at this point, my assumption is that it had come out of the sea container, done some kind of processing, but now was being shipped by truck in bales to another processing center.
That's what you could see on the imagery.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if it ends up in another facility that's less, I would say less formal, had a big urban.
Less formal than the one you had before,
Yes.
where you knew exactly what there was some kind of air control, water control before.
No, at this first location, I couldn't tell if there was any sort of controls. It was an open recycling yard. You could kind of see bales there. Definitely some intermediate technology, sort of low grade industrial scale processing. And then the final location was in an area that actually Li Wen got to go.
You went yourself?
Yes, she did.
Okay. Okay, so you sent her. You say, hey, go check it out.
Yeah. So through the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives and Break Free from Plastic Network, we've made contact with Li Wen, who was able to visit several months later that very location and got to see what the conditions at that site was, and basically what she found.
So we're not saying it was like this, okay? That's just the but
it was like that.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Basically, a small facility, sort of semi-covered, some open area where the materials were out in the open, exposed to the rain, etc. And then under a roof was a small cement tank with something like this to agitate the materials for washing. The materials would be broken out of a bale, hand sorted on the ground into maybe 20 or 30 different categories by color and type of plastic, put into a trough like this and washed, and then air dried, and then sent to another location nearby where they would be chipped into small pellets, small flakes, and then depending on the material, they'd be sold either as flake or then melted down and extruded into these long sort of spaghetti strands and chopped up into tiny little nurdles that we call pellet. And so, but what Li Wen found when she went there was that this location was no longer receiving international plastic. Already, what was that, 2015, early 2016? 2016, I guess, when we sent it in August. It arrived in October. I think he went early 2016.
So one conclusion is that things are moving all the time. It's very hard to know for sure, like it's always going there, right? The market, it's a commodity market.
Yes, and already for that type of plastic, the Chinese government was restricting the inflow of those plastics to, at least to that region.
Okay.
And really clamping down on the informal market in particular. And so those people were complaining that they could no longer get the plastic that they wanted to process in their area.
So there was writing on the wall already in some way.
That's it.
There are more details to that part of the story, and I invite you to ask Martin, or we have more details on the podcast as well, where you're over 2 episodes. But can you speak to like the broader picture of those experiments, like because you sent other trackers later on because you knew that it wouldn't get there anymore, you still want to learn more. We'll have a part 3 about your insights and what you would like to see happen, but can you speak to other experiments that you've made lately?
Yeah, so since then, we've continued to try and get this sort of simple tracking system to work, and we've had success. Recently, we put another one on the same kind of plastic, and that just disappeared. I thought it would go to Hong Kong and then someplace else, because I, based on Li Wen's experience, knew that it probably wasn't going to China anymore. And about 3 weeks later, it showed up near Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. This actually gave me a little bit of confidence. I was worried that it was going to go into a less developed country, one that had even less regulatory capacity. The place that it ended up is under a large industrial complex roof in a business park. I can't see what's in there. Hopefully one of our colleagues from Malaysia will be able to go and visit that site and see what the conditions are like there. But I have no confidence that the next tracker will end up in that same location.
Right. So that's, I think, a very good first-hand illustration of one of the challenges, is that even when you have to export, or you make the choice to export that plastic, it's very hard to get the data and to be confident on where it's going. We'll see you for part 3. Let's give a round of applause to Martin and thanks for sharing. Now I will call our second panel. So we have Antonino Folfari, if you want to come with me here, from Plastic Recyclers Europe. So I give you this microphone. Jean-Marc Simon, who is the director of Zero Waste Europe. We can give them a hand as they... And Sylvie Drouland, who is Zero Waste Lifestyle Influencer, we can call you, if you want to sit with Jean-Marc over there. Welcome to you. So here, in this part of the discussion, we're talking about working upstream. What are realistic measures for plastic reduction and better recycling capabilities in the EU? So looking at this global reality we're dealing with, what can we do? We started to touch on this in the first panel, but like in the first panel, I'd like to go through a first round of insights, starting with you, Sylvie. Maybe what is your view on all this, and what would you like to see happen in the coming 2 years?
My lifestyle is very different because we don't use plastic anymore, so we don't have trash.
You don't use plastic anymore?
We try, in fact, so we don't buy plastic packaging and so on. So what I heard here is for me very, I think my new lifestyle is a solution for this problem.
Okay.
If the people, I think, in another way.
Okay, so we're going to talk more about this. Thank you. Jean-Marc, how do you see this? You're very plugged to that topic, and you work also on the, let's say, the impact that this kind of smart lifestyle could have also at the European level.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if everybody lives a zero waste lifestyle, that can have a huge impact. So I encourage anybody to follow the example of Sylvie. But still, I think it's a political problem, and that it's not only should be those who volunteer to go down this path. I think that the policies should be there for people to be able to take the right decisions unconsciously. And if you want to summarize it, I think it should be easier and cheaper to waste less, to do the right thing, than to do the wrong thing. And today the problem is cheaper and easier to do the wrong thing, to consume more plastic, to waste more, and so, well, the consequences we're seeing.
Okay. Antonino, you represent a large number of recyclers here in Europe, and we started to touch on some of the points at the incentive level and so on, but can you give a few thoughts on what you're looking at right now from the recycler perspective and the plastic strategy and those global realities?
Yeah. Well, the problem is that waste is always following the cheapest route. So if the cheapest route is to go to China, it will go to China. If the cheapest route is to landfill it, it will be landfilled. And today we've been waiting way too long to review the way the legislation is managing our waste, and actually we see that it doesn't fit the purpose. And now we are in no solution. And we will face problems in the coming weeks, because we heard that it takes few weeks for the waste to reach China, so it means that in the coming weeks people will stop sending their waste to China, and it will start piling up here.
Mm.
So we need to work on the difference, and urgently work on solutions for that. And the solutions we have mentioned before, it's first design, making sure that we collect and sort everything, and then have the right recycling technology to upgrade the material.
Okay.
And of course we need to rethink the way we are consuming our products.
So let's start at the top of the waste hierarchy with good design and a reduction and the lifestyle part of or those options that you're talking about, Jean-Marc. What should that look like? Sylvie, can you give just a few specific examples of things that helped you drastically reduce your plastic consumption and that ultimately are going to create a lot less problems down the value chain?
So we begin with the prevention. We decide to not buy products with plastics. So this is the beginning, I think, of our démarche, our way of living.
So for instance, if you just can be specific, just to help people illustrate, I'm a big fan of this, but I'm just trying to really be very specific here.
There is a lot of different 5 principles that you need to follow. You need to decide to refuse to say, for example, for some objects that you receive, you can say, do I take it or do I not take it? And we try to say, okay, we will not take it. For example, goodies and so on can be stopped. You can say, I don't want any more goodies, and so this is a solution to have less plastics on planet. You need to reduce, so you need to decide to say, okay, do I need to have this object? Can I do without? For example, in our house, we have a lot of different objects in the kitchen, many times the same objects. So we can say, I will hold only one. I don't need to have 5 fork. I don't know the name in English. My English is not so perfect, I think. But
very good.
Yeah, you don't need to have a lot of different, the same objects. You can use only one. You need to reuse. So when something is broken, if you have something and you want to give it another life, you need to be creative and to say, okay, what can I do with this object? You can give him another way of life. For example, a bottle can become a lamp or can become each other. It's each other, and you can also repair. This is possibility. If you buy quality products, this is normally possibly. This is possible to repair, and there is a lot of different places where you can do that. And at least at the end of the processes, you decide to recycle. This is the end. Right. This is not the beginning for me.
Okay, that's great. Jean-Marc, I know you're very keen on those themes, and from the European perspective, you're very keen on the plastic reduction discussion. When I hear this, I'm inspired, but I'm like, this is hard. There's a lot of effort on me, the consumer, a lot of pressure on me, the consumer. How do you see the smart lifestyle taking over, and what are some immediate initiatives that we can start to implement via the plastic strategy, for instance? What are some of the things you're pushing for?
So I think that we have seen, and we're going to see with the new measures from China, that we are producing lots of low-value plastic that we don't want in Europe. Or the only thing we can do with it is kind of burn it, which is like a very inefficient way to use a material. And what we really need is to create the framework for the right incentives to go. Basically, we cannot recycle our way out of the plastic problem. We are seeing that. So it's not a matter of only recycling more, it's a matter of reducing. And I think for me, the measure of success of the upcoming plastic strategy is going to be actually how serious we are about tackling the real problem that is, well, we don't need that much plastic, and that we cannot recycle all of this because most of it is actually downcycling.
So can you give a few examples, because there are products that in particular are very problematic and have an impact on a large scale, and where alternatives exist? What would that be?
So there are many, even though they're not that well known. But I mean, when it comes to, I mean, today we know that that flexible packaging is a problem. Like all the pouches, these are like growing exponentially every year. And well, and Antonino can explain maybe how can we approach that from a quality recycling perspective that is economically viable and environmentally sensible. But easier than that. Plastic bottles, for example, for bottled water. What sense does it make? I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago with a simple measure of actually putting water fountains in the city, like putting 80 water fountains, they reduce the plastic waste in 2,000 tons in 1 year. Imagine if that goes mainstream. That's a very concrete example. We want water, we don't want the packaging that comes with it when we can avoid it. There's many other examples of single-use packaging for which we can find alternatives.
Okay, thank you. I'm teasing here and there to get some questions going in a couple of minutes. Antonino, how should recyclers work with brands and with good design? And probably you're shooting yourself in the foot by taking the plastic reduction discussion too far, no? Or should we still have things to recycle?
No. I mean, it's a clear priority to reduce the consumption of plastics, but it is clear that not everyone is as a front runner as you are, and we will still produce a lot of plastic waste. So we want it or not, it will be there. So we need to work on design. Some good designs are there. You were mentioning the bottle. It's one of the only product which is designed from the beginning as something which has to be recycled. Industry made a big effort to recycle it. It goes to back to bottle, half of it now. So it's improving, and the quality of it is very good. The problem is that you have other products, like you were saying, the multi-layers, laminates, pouches, which, because of LCA thinking, looks better than other rigid plastic, which are more recyclable. And at the end, we are swapping those materials when it's less efficient at the end. So also there, we need to work on solutions. And probably we'll see that some cases we don't have a solution, and we need to rethink a new way of putting alternative products on the market.
Isn't the best way to capture 100% of the bottles a deposit return scheme EU-wide?
I think that it's being demonstrated by many systems across Europe. Now it's a matter of getting it implemented as soon as we can.
Okay. Questions over there? I don't see you. Can someone? Yes. Thank you. At the very, you can pass on the microphone. Maybe collective effort.
Hi, Ferran Rosa from Zero Zero. I had a question for Antonino. You've seen the presentations before, and in European legislation, we can count for recycling whatever we export when the recycling happens in equivalent situations, in equivalent conditions. I would like to have your opinion whether the recycling happening outside of Europe follows equivalent criteria in terms of environmental protection, labor protection, and also would like to have your insight when it comes to potential how to stimulate internal domestic recycling in Europe. Thank you.
So the first question is, to answer you, we don't have in Europe a common standard of what is environmental friendly recycling. So how can we have something worldwide? So the first thing is to set up what do we mean by economically and environmental-friendly recycling in Europe, and that should have been done back in '98 when the legislation was voted. It was done, and then on the other side, the first thing to have quality is again on design. We say that the recycled quality is not good. It's simply because the products were never made to be recycled. So we can turn the problem as much as we want. At a certain point, if we want to incorporate recyclates in new products, the first thing we need to do is to rethink the way we've been designing the products to make sure that the quality of the recyclates will be there at the end of the life cycle. And without that, we can continue discussing, but the recyclate quality will be always lower than the virgin.
Pressure on the design stage. Other question? Anyone? Over there at the end. We're making your life a little bit difficult, maybe. Some wine on the floor.
Thank you. Nicolas Humet, Hazardous Waste Europe. I think that the main problem we have in plastic is, of course, the quality. When we talk about eco-design or design, it's for the future. What we need also to tackle is the existing plastic issues. And we have a lot of problem of quality. And of course, we have a problem with substance of concern in certain plastic. I can take the example of, for example, in France, the WE plastic with brominated flame retardant. We know that at least 20,000 tons of those plastics should not go to recycling, but we know that they are not going in other routes. So this means that this plastic is diluted with other type of plastic and coming to the loop again. So if we continue that also, we will continue to have problem with the quality of plastics.
You can react to this, Antonio?
You're right that some streams have problems, but the vast majority, which is coming from packaging, are without any substance of very concern. So it's right, we need to work on solutions for those streams, but they represent less than 5% of the issue, which has to be tackled.
So the priority should be on packaging and the single-use plastic.
We have, in Europe, more or less, we are producing 24 million of plastic waste every year, and 60% of it is packaging.
Okay.
So the biggest chunk has to come to rethink the way we use packaging, but also to look to the design of packaging.
Nadine, yeah. If you can remind your name and your answer.
Yes, so Nadine de Kreef, representing FEAT. A question for you, Antonino. I mean, if you say yes, the quality needs to be improved, I think we can all agree that quality can be improved. The more processing you do, the better the quality will be. But this has an extra cost. So are the reprocessors prepared to pay that extra cost? Because you say it follows the cheapest route. Not necessarily. As I was saying earlier, you need the demand and you need this reincorporation of the recyclates, but this extra cost and this extra burden, it is feasible. The question will be, are you prepared to pay this extra cost?
If we look to the history of PET recycling, when it started in 87, they were going to fibers. Now they're going back to food contact material because they made the investments behind to close the loops where you can close the loops. This will have now to be replicated for other materials, other products, and it will take time because it took 30 years for PET, it will take more years for the rest, or shorter years because we have more experience.
But in the UK, the closed-loop recycling has food-grade quality, but it went bankrupt. You know,
but,
it cannot compete with the same from Virgin. So the thing is,
there you're picking the problem. Yes, that's a big problem in UK is that it's not collected and sorted as it should. Everything is mixed together, so forget it to make quality.
Yeah. Okay, so there is the design and then there's a collection.
Yeah.
And that's why they export 70 or 80% of their waste to China.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Correct, but it's interesting how we continue to think inside the box here. Because you have a system that is not efficient. You cannot make it efficient. In the best case, you're going to be a less bad solution. The problem is that you need to rethink the system. It's not by optimizing this material that we're going to find a solution. We need to actually rethink the delivery system, or like how when we were fed before without all this plastic. we can rethink the way we are using plastics. Because plastics are very useful for certain applications, but for some others, you don't need to actually like optimize the system until you can manage to make a plastic that is profitable in a way or another. It's a matter of like, let's think a bit outside the box, because without this thinking, again, we are caught into this inside the box thinking about optimizing a system that is not working by definition, and there's no way out.
And I feedback because there is a study from a case study that you guys issued about those reusable diapers, for instance, which are, baby diapers are 1 ton per baby per year, more or less. It's a big problem. Even when you have 80% or 85% recycling in your city, you're still looking at hygiene products in the end. And a disruptive approach that you're putting forward is a service economy at the local level that is a job creator, getting a few entrepreneurs going and having a delivery and washing service that is more like industrial scale to supply the families within the community. That's, I think, what we're talking about, like a more sort of radical approach to problem solving. And then we don't buy those throwaway diapers in the first place, so there's not even a recycling problem because they get reused.
That is just an example, but I mean, the thing is, if we had put the amount of investment into trying to recycle single-use diapers into actually finding a different system, we would have found it a long time ago. Basically, without any investment, we are already running quite economically viable, completely environmentally sustainable, and socially inclusive systems for nappy reuse in a series of nurseries and with some people, without much of a budget. The amount of money that has gone into designing diapers, promoting them, etc. I mean, imagine that we do this for all the other problematic waste streams, and that investment goes into thinking outside the box and thinking a new delivery system or a new purpose for the concept. Then we are closer to the solution. It's just a matter of putting the money in the right direction. It's not about optimizing a bad system.
Some reaction to this? We've got a couple of minutes over there in the middle.
Hi, John Paul from the European Glass Packaging Industry. I've been to a few of these events on plastics now, and I find it quite interesting because it seems that there are lots of solutions, and the problems always seem to lie elsewhere from wherever the solution is coming from. So you have different organizations saying, yeah, we've got solutions, but then the problem is lying upstream or downstream. So my big question with this whole plastics issue is, who would you suggest should take responsibility to drive this forward? Because at the end of the day, I've heard a lot of commitments, but they sound great, and you could almost be forgiven to think that there isn't a problem when you hear some of the commitments going on. But at the same time, who is going to check whether these commitments are actually being met? And at the end of the day, who is going to be responsible for making sure that this huge alliance that you'll need is going to come together and actually deliver? So a question on responsibility to the three of you.
Do you want to take a second question at the same time?
All right, let's take a second question. You just memorize this one, because the next one that's coming, I think, is a tough one as well.
Yeah, my name is Bernard. I've been working in the plastic industry for the last 30 years, and I'm an expert in plastic recycling, so we know we can do a lot. There's a big need for the raw material transition. I think that's everybody's thing, where prevention and reuse, of course, are a big challenge. And also stopping overconsumption. But I give you one back, because we put a lot of energy as a society now to go for an energy transition, where we build windmills and where we go for solar panels and where we buy the Teslas. Where is the recycling solution for those products? So we may solve now the discussion on a PET bottle or a shopping bag, but we are creating bigger problems by everybody being in a parade to array the big invention of the windmills and all those things, where not one single cent is put in to end-of-life solutions. So the question is, what is more sustainable, a Tesla or a Hummer? I would vote for the Hummer.
Okay, so first on the first question. First on the first question, which is about who should take responsibility and how to get some real momentum going. Jean-Marc?
I think right now the responsibility is in the hands of the Commission, who has to come up with a strategy in 1 month's time. So we need to set the direction, etc. The producers need to be made responsible for what they put in the market, that's clear, and today, I'm not saying probably they're not paying enough, but clearly they're not getting the incentives to actually do things otherwise. And who's going to give them these incentives will need to have to come from a regulatory framework somewhere. So that's on the first question. Should I...
In the Hummer or the Tesla?
A bicycle.
Okay. Okay, one more question, and then we will hear the third part with Martin. One more question, please, or a reaction. Yes, Kostas.
Yes, thank you. We hear that almost if we take the polymers and add the different additives there that are needed to give the differentiated functionality, there are almost, let's say, 5,000 different types of polymers out there. How many of these are good? So, to rephrase the question, how are we going to change the innovation model? Because innovation is driven by cost effectiveness and new functionality. And innovation brought us here. And I cannot see what is going to reverse the current trends of innovation. So, tell us, 5,000 types of plastics, how many of these are good for the industry of recycling?
Please go ahead.
Now we are talking about an industry which is doing more than 360 billion a year. I think that if the research is put into a bit more into recycling solutions, they will come with a solution. And we see that we were asking responsibility. We see that the producers now are getting warmed up or waking up slowly.
Make those shampoo bottles with ocean plastic.
They are realizing that I think they need to take responsibility of their products, and also maybe it's because it's a young, let's say, relatively young industry compared to glass, where the producers are not integrated into the recycling step. So all that has to change in order to make the research in the right area, and maybe rethink the way they are putting 5,000 plastics grades on the market. And the solution will come for sure.
I'm going to cheat and break the rules, and we're going to do one more question, even if I had said it was over.
I think one question I want to ask for you is like, why China is such a big market for our imported plastic? Because the demand for the material. So when you think about the solution, you have to think like how to change, create the market demand. And recycle doesn't mean like the end of the materials. And so we have to think like first to do reduction and to prevent the generation of plastic first. That must be considered. And I mean, when you did have that, you have to think about that, because manufacturing in the Western world is very weak now. And so after even you're pelletizing the plastic, how will you use that?
Right. Thank you very much. A big round of applause for our panel. We're going to be able to talk more about this on the other side of the wall. But before that, I'd like to call Martin for part 3, where we're going to get your insights on. So like here we dove into what's going on in Europe and the plastic strategy and some of the realities we're facing here. Back to the global level and to that export market and looking at your experiment. First on your experiments, you're planning on keeping that going. Can you talk to about the potential to scale this and what it could bring to recyclers in general, or to the whole ecosystem?
Well, it's just a very opaque marketplace. So you put things out as a recycler into the world, and you don't know precisely or exactly what markets are going to, particularly now as these markets are changing so quickly, and particularly for the least valuable materials. For us, we started collecting these non-bottle plastics in 2013, mixed rigid plastics 1 through 7. We were getting about $10 a ton for them out of the Port of Oakland in California. We're currently paying between $50 and $70 a ton to export these materials.
It's better to land.
When you're paying for it, well, it's a little cheaper than landfilling in California, but not much. When you're paying to export, it creates an incredibly perverse incentive on the other side of that to dispose of it in a way that is very cheap. So this has raised a lot of concern for the more ethical recyclers in California, and raising questions about developing infrastructure within the US, will we start sending more of these materials to landfill?
What do you think about this option? Should it stay in the US, and if yes, under what conditions?
Well, the thing about these particular types of materials is that the innovation context that was mentioned before, these plastics are so fantastic in so many ways for certain brands and certain products and certain marketers. I mean, the fresh foods industry has been completely revolutionized by some of these plastics in terms of berries and lettuce and perishables. You know, these pouches and other, so there's people in the middle of this system that are getting extreme benefits from this packaging revolution. But it's on the extraction side and the manufacturing side, and then on the tail end, that we're feeling the full impacts of them. So changing the context in which that innovation is having, I thought the comment about taxing, placing a tax on the petrochemical side to pay for this, you know, so the disposal solutions and investment on that side, it was very interesting. I think to be able to process these materials in California, we're talking about very large, capital-intensive plastics sorting facilities. There was one that was tried in Baltimore on the East Coast with funding from industry. That has since closed. I'm not sure why. So,
but it needs to be large scale to be efficient enough. That's what you're saying.
Yes, because the labor costs for sorting these is so high.
Okay, and when it comes to the potential of your GPS tracking solution to at least shed some light on what's going on, what if there was a research program that was deploying this at scale? What are some of the next steps for that approach?
Yeah, I think you know, what we're doing now is sort of proof of concept, that we can actually track these down to the specific location. I think if we had hundreds or thousands of these things out there in the world, we'd learn a lot of things that maybe we don't want to know about. When I ask my local governments, even very progressive and forward-thinking county agency, Stop Waste in my area, you know, I asked them, do you want to partner with us? Would you fund a project like this? And they say, well, the materials are still moving. They must be going someplace good. And I say, well, they're going someplace. And I think, you know, this change in Chinese policy is a wake-up call. And maybe now some people will start to say, okay, we need to take a deeper look at where it's going, because some of it certainly will stop. And, you know, that was mentioned about stockpiling and the materials backing up. And that's going to apply some real pressure on a lot of different people to really think about what are our solutions, what are our proposals, who's going to pay for it. Because if we're paying to get rid of it now and the prices keep going down, at some point we can't even sell it. You know, we collect another type of plastic. These are bulky, rigid plastics, buckets, crates, lawn furniture. That stuff we can't even move right now. So it's just piling up. At some point we have to stop taking it or stop trying to recycle it, and that will then go to landfill.
Right. One question for Martin, and then we'll wrap up with closing notes. Anyone
anyone interested in GPS tracking something, it doesn't have to be a plastic bale. Over there, yes. Sorry.
Ross Bartley from the Bureau of International Recycling. I'd say that GPS tracking is interesting to shed some light on some problem areas. It's been used on e-waste, where particularly there's some highlight of illegal activities. There is a great difference between what happens in the US and what happens in Europe. And Europe has many laws that the US doesn't have, and particularly for exports, that there are prohibitions to a number of countries, so it's not a free-for-all, that material will go to any country out there. And the point I make about also about this traceability is the European legislation requires that the non-hazardous waste and non-OECD countries, that there's a paperwork form for tracking where the materials goes to. So I do wonder on the GPS tracking, it's fine if one's trying to find illegal shipments. I mean, it might be interesting, people talk about the Internet of Things, but there is actually a system in place in Europe to look at traceability. And there's plenty of legislation in Europe. It's just the way that the legislation is actually implemented. And I think that's something just to bear in mind.
Yeah, I know there's a current research project in place to try and actually get that data into a form and in a context at a global level to be able to see what, at least on paper, is happening. And what we hear from partners in the Global South is that there's a lot of shenanigans that happens with shipping companies that have an address in one country but are shipping to another country, and the source is actually a third country. And I think that GPS tracking will give you some confidence that that paperwork system is actually working, and it does it in real time, whereas you know, getting all that paperwork even through the databases and stuff may not be as timely in terms of when it lands in a certain port, where's it going from that port?
Right.
So you may be able to get the country, but then what's happening inside, say, Indonesia, may be vastly different on one island than another. And so being able to, or even within one island, so being able to see precisely what kind of conditions it's going to might give a more refined picture of what's happening, and then you would know whether or not the laws are being broken.
Yeah, and the access to information, I think, is really important to find beyond the port, because even in Europe, if you call the custom or the brokers, you can get a list of harbors, basically. And so if anyone wants to try this at home, get a plastic bale and then just ask Martin for the user manual. I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this talk show, and I will now call Delphine Levy-Alvarez to the microphone to give some closing notes and the instructions for next steps. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. So I will just let you speak on some of the conclusions and things that you're taking away. You're co-hosting this this talk show with Plastic Recyclers Europe, and it's a hot moment now in Brussels.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all the discussions tonight, and I know it's not comfortable for those of you who are sitting on the floor, but I think it's a big sign of interest for the topic. We've heard many things tonight. And what struck me is really probably the long way that our waste is doing from Europe to other countries. And what we're standing over basically is low-grade plastics, things that are mostly coming out of single-use plastics, and things that we might be able to avoid or we can actually avoid, as Sylvie showed us with her front-running lifestyle, but still a lot of, as can still make improvement. So I think that what we've heard is that we need regulation, we need concrete and ambitious targets, we need standards that are applied worldwide, not only in Europe, but we also need to make sure that we're not having double standards with other countries, especially countries where we're sending waste.
At Rethink Plastic, what are 3 examples of measures that you would really like to see appear in the year to come in legislation and in practice and being enforced as well?
So we would like to see concrete measures on single-use plastics, so banning some of the most found items on the beach, or at least giving the countries the possibility to do it. Concrete framework on microplastics, making sure that we're getting rid of intentionally added microplastics in our products, and potentially prevention targets on plastic production and plastic waste production.
Thank you. What's next for us right now? Like passing the door. What's
Okay,
next?
right now, I guess you're hungry. So we have 3 kinds of soups, and probably you will want to go towards 2 of them only. And I'm just inviting you to ask yourself, why don't you want to have the 3rd kind of soup? But it's sort of a surprise, so I'm going to leave it here. Thanks a lot, everybody, for coming tonight.